Alana King bowled Sophia Dunkley around her legs in a World Cup final. Leg spin, white ball, sweep shot, stumps hit. It was magnificent. And not that long after, she dragged Catherine Brunt out of her ground and had her stumped. Earlier, she took the wicket of captain Heather Knight as well. And in the space of 3 months, Alana King has gone from a nobody to a World Cup winner for Australia. But the reason for that, outside of her own hard work and talent, is that the system she has plugged into is so magnificent. You don't have players with the talent of King on the bench without knowing exactly what you're doing and being so far advanced over every other team. And because of that, the Australian women's team have been one of the most dominant teams ever in the history of cricket.
This is the last knock. My dad told me to say this.
So let's just take a look at the first real modern day dominant cricket team, the West Indian men. I mean, when you say the word dominant, they were about as dominant as any sports team had ever been over nearly 2 decades. And while we talk about how great that is a lot and how much they changed the game and the black excellence side of things, there's another story that also needs to be told. For instance, when handing out the Hall of Fame spots to the West Indians from that era, an Australian should also be inducted for his work with the West Indian team. Dennis Waite was the team's physiotherapist and trainer from 1977 until 2000, almost completely overlapping with the team being one of the greatest sides of all time. His training took a team of amateurs and made them professionals physically. They were just as talented with or without him, but he kept them on the field, strengthened their cores, ensured that they could run in hard all day and play long innings, and they took care of the rest. But Waite didn't do this on his own. West Indies cricket went professional through necessity. Their players always had skills, but their board couldn't pay them. So from Leary Constantine to Garfield Sobers, their best players turned to the English leagues, meaning that their players were playing cricket all year round in a way that other players weren't. Then county cricket also became a huge part of West Indies cricket. Now they were being tested at home and away consistently. And when playing in county cricket, even when it was a low stakes county game, it was huge for them because every game they were playing for their mortgage. And the final part of this West Indian professionalism was the Kerry Packer World Series, a rebel cricket league that split the game but unified the West Indies team. And more importantly, professionalised them even further. Kerry Packer went out of his way to make sure that they had everything they needed, including hiring, and that was the reason they ended up with Dennis Waite. So now you had this unique team that had grown up on varied West Indian pitches, that knew how to play on English and Australian wickets, were 12 months of the year cricketers who knew how to play under the highest possible pressure all the time. And they had someone looking after their physical well-being. All this came together with their own advanced thinking and methods that cricket hadn't used before to form one of the most dominant teams that any sport had ever seen. The fact that they did all this as permanent outsiders is also truly amazing. But they were the best professionals in the game at this point. And who knocked them off and then went on a shorter, but maybe even more dominant run? Australia. That Kerry Packer Rebel League promised professionalism to Aussies that didn't actually quite come straight away. But through a bunch of different reasons, cricket in Australia had this huge professional boom, partly inspired by Australian rules football's own professional explosion, and to a lesser extent what happened with rugby league. But also at the same time, sporting academies became a thing in Australia when the government invested in them and cricket had one. But the real difference was the state and national contracts, which came from a strong and healthy player union. All these things came together, and suddenly Australia was a fully professional country and no one else was even close. And the Australian players had done well as amateurs in the amateur era. But when it became pros versus amateurs, they exploded cricket. And let me explain that quickly through 2 stories, Matthew Hayden and Shane Warne. Let's start with the King's finger. From 1996 until 2000, Shane Warne's spinning finger almost combusted. At the same time, he had massive problems with his shoulder as well. He was even dropped from the Australian team at one point. Putting the revs that he did on the ball was unnatural. It's why no one had ever done it before, and it caused massive stress to his entire bowling arm. In a previous era, Warne would have been pretty much on his own, which is actually what more or less happened to Dennis Lillee. But in Warne's era, Cricket Australia were there to assist him the whole way. So instead of having a great start to his career before struggling in the second half, we actually got a 15 years of near enough to peak Shane Warne. Put it this way, what happens to Australia's dominance from 2000 to 2007 without Warne? And it's not just Warne. Jason Gillespie could barely get on the field. Without that professional setup around him, he probably would have been lost to the game. That's 2 pretty good bowlers to lose from that era. How good is Australia without Warne and Gillespie? So let's add another one. Matthew Hayden. He was a phenomenal Shield player from almost day one, breaking records year after year, but he failed at the top level consistently in his first few goes. In another era, he might have retired or even just worked his way through with obvious weaknesses within his game. But that wasn't the system he was in. There was incredible coaching around, but there was also something else, this secondary professional structure. So when Matt Hayden wanted to improve his game, he got on the phone to Cricket Australia and asked them if he could go on a development team tour to Asia. Where was Matt Hayden's breakout series? India. These things don't happen by accident. And there are plenty of other stories. There are many players from the Australian system who would have just been lost or would not have developed the way that they did. Certainly the entire team would nowhere near have been as strong if it wasn't for this professional backup. And instead, great players went on to be greater, often for longer, and replacement level players could come in and dominate as well. And one of the reasons England managed to be so good in cricket for so long is because they also had a professional system. Now, it wasn't perfect and it didn't make sense. And quite often, it actually meant that the players were better for their counties than they were for England. But you see again and again in cricket, having these professional structures really helps people just be better at cricket. And of course, all that brings us back to Alana King and the Australian women's team, who at the moment have a more dominant period than the Australian or the West Indian men ever did. It's not as long, but it's brutal. Their win-loss record looks made up. And I know that because every time I'm about to say it out loud, I go and fact check it just to make sure I haven't got the numbers wrong. And the history of professionalism in women's cricket is actually a terribly sad story. At first, it was actually a successful, if not utterly creepy league that was made up in the late 1800s in the UK between two made-up teams, and lots of people came to watch. And then the male founders ran off with the money. And that was all women's cricket really had as far as professionalism goes until the English women's team became fully professional in 2014. Until then, women were still making decisions between paying their mortgage or playing for their country. And that was the women who were allowed to do that. That was the women who lived in good enough areas to play decent level amateur cricket. The numbers of ways that we tried to stop women playing cricket is phenomenal. The barriers that we put up, and they just kept playing. And when the England women's team went professional, they didn't quite get the bump they were looking for, partly because Australia and New Zealand went professional at a similar time. And now it's gone as far as the Brazilian women's team is professional. Even the Sri Lankans had a boost when they didn't go pro, but instead their armed forces started paying their bills. This meant that so many teams around the world had access to a group of professional women players, which is great, but not when one team professionalizes around 100 women and everyone else is doing around 25. And it's also worth remembering that again, like what happened with the men, there was a bit of luck with the women. At the same time the Women's Big Bash was being formed, the Women's Australian Football League was being formed. Suddenly, if you were a woman aged between 18 and 22, there was a career pathway for you if you were a very good athlete in multiple sports. So many women who would have been lost to sport because they would have had to go off and get jobs and do other things came flying in from nowhere. So there was even a higher boost when it comes to Australian women's cricket. England and India could and should have done the same. And of course, England have eventually with the 100. And right now there are plans for a women's PSL, an IPL, and probably even a CPL. But one way or another, the Australian competition still had a 6-year head start. I think we just saw what a 6-year head start looks like when it comes to professionalism. And there are so many that actually worry that Australia's success is so full on that it will actually stop others trying to catch up. But that's not what we saw in the men's game. Teams did actually try and copy the West Indies, and they did copy Australia, especially when it came to the academy systems and national contracts. If you want to move a slow-moving sport, which sadly since World War II, cricket has often been, one of the best things to do is just have one team be really good at it and watch everyone else try and catch up. But let me just finish up with a short story I had with a Women's Big Bash batting coach on why women hit the ball further now. He came up with a lot of reasons. Shaking women away from the coaching manual, better bats for them, before they used boys or men's bats too often. But the main thing that he kept coming back to was before a woman cricketer would go to the gym, but she had to fit that around her work and other training. So if she was already working 40 hours a week and then had to put another 20 hours of cricket training on top of that, doing extra practice on her skills and going to the gym just didn't exist. For 7 years, the Australian women have had 100 players to choose from completely full professionals through to part-time paid athletes. And so many of these players have just vastly improved. Alana King has been part of the professional setup and had access to the best coaching available to her, and fitness and nutrition and just general support. And because of that, when they called for her only 3 months ago, she was ready. So ready that she helped win the World Cup final for them. And that's the thing, these Australian players are always ready. And because of that, we've just never seen another team dominate like this. Since Harmanpreet dumped them from the past World Cup, they've gone 40 wins for only 2 losses. And sure, other teams might well catch up, but they have a long way to go. This was as dominant as we've seen any team in cricket. They didn't build up Alana King, they assembled an Alana King army.